And with that, the UFC 143 results are in, controversial nonetheless. Good morning, hello, and welcome to another installment of Pound for Pound with Brian and David, the show that debates all things UFC. We got another great show for you guys lined up today as we're going to review the UFC 143 as well as the UFC on Fox results, as well as take a look towards UFC 144 in Japan later this month. At this time, I'm bringing my co-host David. David, how are you doing today?
Brian, I'm doing fantastic. Great fights last night at UFC 143. Great fights at UFC on Fox. Lots of things to discuss, lots of things to debate. Let's dive in.
Round one begins now. David, UFC on Fox saw two fights to determine the number one contender. In the first fight, Sonnen vs. Bisping saw controversy and going to decision. What'd you think of that fight?
Brian, I could not believe what I saw at this fight. The ending decision with Chael Sonnen having his hand raised, I couldn't believe it. Michael Bisping came in there, followed an excellent game plan, kept it on the feet, stuffed the takedowns, was active, and then Chael Sonnen gets the victory? I just don't get it.
David, we must not have been watching the same fight because I saw Chael Sonnen come out there and impose his will in round one and jump all over Michael Bisping. And since we did not see him as dominant as we have in past opponents over Michael Bisping, it kind of looked like he was equal to Michael Bisping, and Michael Bisping may have, won over the hearts of some people watching. But at the same time, Sonnen won rounds 1 and 3 hands down, and he easily walked away with the decision 29-28. Whoever the judge that did score at 30-27 is out of his mind, though. Bisping did win round 2, but he did not win that fight.
All I'm going to say is Michael Bisping for the first time wasn't booed by U.S. fans. I think
that's
true.
The fight. That's true. Michael Bisping definitely won over some fans with that fight, and he shows his wrestling is top point, and he has some takedown defense. Moving on, in the main event, we had Rashad Evans fighting Phil Davis in what many can say is a lackluster event, as Dana White even tweeted the fight of the night bonus and submission and knockout of the night bonus before that fight was even over. What does that tell you?
It tells me that this fight was extremely boring, even for Dana White, the man that puts on these fights. I'll, in full disclosure, Brian, tell you that I dozed off during this fight.
That's wow.
I hate to admit it. I hate it because I like Phil Davis. I like Rashad Evans, but I think it's just a point to prove that Rashad Evans just came in here that much better, that much more skilled. He's a veteran of the octagon. Phil Davis showed that he was green behind the ears, and Rashad came out and exploited him on the feet. Was able to prevent Phil Davis from using his wrestling, and that's what won the fight. There's nothing else to be said, right?
Yeah, that's true. It wasn't that eventful of a fight. I bet Dana White and the UFC officials would have loved to have seen it a little more entertaining, especially on being that it was on Fox. But exactly right. In the days leading up to the fight, Phil Davis and Rashad Evans did all they could to try and hype the fight, at press conferences and at the weigh-ins. But the truth is, Phil Davis was just, an amateur in there compared to Rashad Evans. Rashad Evans is much more experienced and he showed that during the fight in every aspect, on the feet as well as when it went to the wrestling. Phil Davis, he needs to get back in the gym and work on his feet because he did not look comfortable in the striking with Rashad Evans. And that was the story of that fight. All right, David, let's move on to UFC 143. In the co-main event, we saw Mauricio Verdum make his return to the UFC and take on Big Country Roy Nelson in a fight that went to the finish. What'd you think?
I thought it was an entertaining fight. Kept on the feet by Verdum. Proved that he's back and ready to fight in the UFC. I think Fight Metric had him landing over 67% of his significant strikes.
That's some good analyst work.
I'm just reading from a computer screen. But, I think he proved that he's here to fight in the UFC, and he's ready to bring it. What about yourself?
He definitely has shown improvement in his stand-up, and that definitely was the story of that fight. He definitely landed some great Muay Thai knees to Roy Nelson, who, by the way, Roy Nelson is definitely the toughest guy in the UFC. For him to stand in there and take those kind of shots, as well as the kind of shots we see him take from Junior Dos Santos. Roy Nelson, there's nothing else to say other than he's just a tough badass. But no, Verdum definitely is back, and he looks like he's mind focused and he's ready to go in there and make a run at the UFC gold.
Whoa, Brian. As Robert Downey Jr. once said in Tropic Thunder, pump your brakes, kid. I think he has a long way to go before he fights for a title in the stacked heavyweight division for the UFC.
I disagree completely, David. I think one more fight against a top opponent like Frank Mir, for example,
that'd be a good fight.
Exactly, another great jiu-jitsu guy who also is in the mix would earn him the next shot, possibly at the winner between Dos Santos and Overeem. In the 143 main event, we saw Carlos Condit take on Nick Diaz in what is now kind of a controversial decision. David, what do you think of that fight?
Wait, this is a controversial decision for you, Brian?
It is,
saw Carlos Condit just follow a perfectly executed game plan. You know, he landed more significant strikes, dominated the fight, and it was extremely technical. Everyone talks about how great of a striker and boxer that Nick Diaz is. Absolutely not. Carlos Condit came in there, worked his game plan, picked apart Diaz, and came out with the victory. I don't see what the big controversy is.
The big controversy is in that while he did land significant strikes and more strikes throughout the fight, I will never reward a guy for running in the cage. Never have, never will. And Condit, hit a few leg strikes or a few leg kicks and then would punch him and then run away. And Nick Diaz kept the pressure on him, kept him moving backwards. And in my opinion, that is octagon control, and you have to reward that. And Nick Diaz walked him down, punched him in flurries, and landed the more significant strikes, I believe.
You know what, Brian? You come over to my house, I promise you milk and I promise you cookies, but if the oven's broke, you're just going to get milk. You know, if Nick Diaz wanted this fight, wanted so bad. If he wanted to face George St. Pierre, he's calling out George St. Pierre. He should have came in with a better game plan and executed it properly. You know, I don't think that he can just, talk his way back into a fight with GSP just because, he thinks that he landed more fights and he thinks that Carlos Condit ran away from the whole time. Absolutely not. Carlos Condit came in there, picked him apart with his leg kicks and his punches, and came out with the victory.
Nick Diaz, I love him because he's no BS. He doesn't put on a fake facade. He kept moving forward and backing Carlos Condit up. And part of MMA judging and scoring is octagon control. So where do we put an emphasis on octagon control versus running away and striking and running away?
All right, Brian. So I punch you once, run away. Punch you twice, run away. I've punched you twice, but you've punched me 0 times. Now riddle me that. What's going on?
Okay. If I wanted to see a guy punch something and run away, I'd go watch him train instead of buying that fight. We could sit here and argue this all we want, but at the end of the day, Carlos Condit is your new interim champ, and he will be facing George St. Pierre. So, congratulations to Carlos. He had a great game plan, implemented it well against Nick Diaz, frustrated him, and came away with the W, and now he is interim champ. Congratulations. We good with round 1, David?
We're good. With Alistair Overeem making headlines with an alleged assault charge and other UFC fighters having run-ins with the law, what role should the UFC play, if any, in disciplining their fighters? Round 2 begins now.
Well, David, this is a very serious topic because this happens all too often in various sports where we see these athletes making poor decisions. When it comes to the UFC, they need to look at this in a case-by-case situation and evaluate all sides and do their own private investigation and then determine from their findings their course of action. I'm a strong believer in innocent until proven guilty, and really I believe they should let the legal system play its role and play its course and make a determination at the end of that based on the severity of each case.
You know what, Brian? The UFC already has a negative connotation attached to it because it's perceived to be such a brutal sport. And because of that, Dana White needs to take a stand and save face. And, when his fighters are accused of certain things, needs to punish them for that. There needs to be some sort of ramification for whatever thing they decide to do. And, I'm not saying suspend a fighter necessarily for just an accusation, but there needs to be something, hey.
So you're saying there needs to be immediate action?
There definitely needs to be immediate action.
So,
just because of the way that people perceive this sport. That's the only reason why. Because it's already such a brutal sport that they don't need, they don't want people calling their fighters thugs or anything, because people aren't like that. Fighters aren't like that. There's only a few people that have these assault charges or allegations attached with them.
So let me ask you this, because if you're saying immediate action with the recent charges against Alistair Overeem, are you saying that they maybe should suspend Alistair Overeem, which then would, kind of mix up the heavyweight division right now in the picture, and that would mean they'd have to find a new opponent for Junior Dos Santos, in your theory?
Well, I think immediate action should be more of along the lines of a fine, whereas, Alistair, you brought this negative publicity to us. It's attached to us in the UFC, and because of that, you're going to be docked however much money. But in the long run, say that these charges are actually true, then I think a suspension is in order.
Right, and that's what I meant by letting the legal system play the court. But innocent until proven guilty, David, so these fighters definitely should have some leeway and not be punished for accusations.
I disagree with that, Brian, but at the end of the day, I think we can both agree that the UFC needs to hold its fighters accountable.
And actions need to be taken.
Agreed. And with that, round 2 comes to an end.
David, for round 3, let's talk about a hot topic that's surrounding the UFC in terms of fighter pay. ESPN Outside the Lines just did a report, and a lot of fighters have come out saying that UFC isn't paying their fighters well enough, and they're putting too much of a censor on what they can and can't do. Let's talk about this for round 3. Round 3 begins now. David, fighter pay. Now, the average UFC fighter on the undercard will get paid around $4,000, an additional $4,000 if they win. That's $8,000, and depending on endorsements, barring let's ignore endorsements for a second. Let's just focus on the fighter pay. Where do you think the UFC should be paying their fighters? And also, if a fighter fights, let's say, 3 times a year on the undercard and wins all 3 times, that's only $24,000. Is that good enough for you?
$24,000, Brian. You must be kidding me. That can't feed a family. I don't understand why these fighters aren't getting paid more. The UFC, God love them, makes a ton of money with these pay-per-view events. They just signed a huge contract with Fox. I just don't understand why they can't bump up pay for these fighters. It just doesn't seem right to me.
But let's look at this for a second. These fighters who people aren't coming to see fight, let's be honest. People are coming to see the main card and mainly the co-main event and the main event. The UFC gives these fighters a platform to showcase their skills. They put these fights on FX and Field TV and give them away for free online. So why, if the UFC is giving these platforms, and no one wants to really watch them, like any other company in the USA, if these fighters perform and improve, they'll eventually get up and improve their name. So they really don't have the right to complain right now when really no one's coming to see them. So right now, $8,000 is more than enough, especially when you look at something like boxing, which pays them less than $1,000 for a fight on the undercard. I think the UFC is doing a well job at equally dispersing the income from these pay-per-view events.
Brian, do I go to a Lakers game to watch Luke Walton play?
No, you don't.
Absolutely not. But do you know how much he gets paid?
I don't.
Probably more than you and I both make combined. That being the point, these lower undercard fighters are part of the UFC product as a whole, and because of that, I feel that they should be reimbursed accordingly.
Now, why I don't go watch Luke Walton play, he's part of an organization that does bring in a lot of money and distributes it among 12 players. The UFC has to distribute its earnings on a pay-per-view or a fight card by about 20 different fighters. So it's a little different, and also, let's be honest, these fighters on the undercard, if it weren't for the UFC, they'd have no outlet to showcase their skills and improve on their income. So the UFC gives them wonderful opportunities. And like I said, like any other business in the USA, if you want to increase your pay and increase your benefits, you need to perform well. And that's all the UFC is asking, for these fighters to perform well. And in that, they're giving them a way to showcase their skills to the public. So if they're able to put if these fighters on the undercard are able to put together a great performance and get notoriety by either a bonus, submission of the night, knockout of the night, what have you, they'll be able to show that to a wider audience than they would without the UFC. So yes, the UFC definitely does pay these fighters enough. And if you look at boxing, who pays them well under what the UFC is paying, the UFC is doing a great job with fighter pay. Any rebuttal, David?
Pay me, Dana. All right, Brian, UFC 143 showcased a new opening for all pay-per-view events. What'd you think? Round 4 begins now.
David, I'm not going to lie. When I heard that they were going to be doing a new opening, I was a little apprehensive because I love the Gladiator. It's a great symbolism in terms of getting ready to go to war in the Coliseum, in the arena. But when I saw this new opening, I was blown away. I loved it. It gave great homage to past, new, and present to the UFC. It showcased some great fights, some great finishes, and one thing I loved was it showed the flags of every country represented within the UFC, which, as you know, is a vast amount of countries, and that just shows tribute to how the UFC is going global and expanding at a rapid pace.
I disagree, Brian. The Gladiator opening sequence was amazing. It's like, are you not entertained? It was absolutely great. Aesthetically, it was just beautiful, and to see this warrior preparing for battle is just how I envision these fighters going into the octagon. So, call me an old school kind of guy, but I liked the Gladiator opening sequence.
I can't disagree with your argument that it is what got them here, and it's kind of, it'd be nice to stay to tradition, but at the same time, starting this new UFC on Fox deal and agreement and partnership, they needed something new. They needed something fresh to kind of like kickstart their new image, and the Gladiator had a great run for however many years, but this is a great representation of the new age UFC. For round 5, David, let's take a look at UFC 144 later on in this month in Japan. I am super pumped for this fight card. It is showcases some great talent. Round 5 begins now. David, first up on the fight, we have Frankie Edgar defending his lightweight title against Ben Henderson. Who you like and why?
Konnichiwa, everyone. In this fight, plain and simple, Frankie Edgar. The man has been there and back with Gray Maynard, proved that he can go to the brink, just about to get knocked out, comes back, dominates the fight, beats Gray Maynard. And, I think the same is going to happen here. It's going to be a battle. Ben Henderson is going to wrestle. Frankie Edgar is going to want to wrestle. But I think the stand-up game, I'm going to give it to Frankie Edgar, and that's what's going to make the difference.
David, you just said it. Ben Henderson's going to want to wrestle. Frankie's going to want to wrestle. But the problem right there for Frankie is I think Ben Henderson's a better wrestler. He's going to bring a lot more wrestling credentials. Now, Frankie, to win this fight, he's going to have to stick and move, kind of similar to what Condit did against Nick Diaz. Ben Henderson's has the tools to beat him, and he's going to get the job done in Japan, and we're going to see a new UFC champion. In the co-main event, I love this fight. I love this light heavyweight showdown between up-and-coming Ryan Bader and Rampage Jackson. Who you like?
Plain and simple, Rampage Jackson. He has returned to where he is known, and that is Japan. He wanted this fight. He asked Dana for this fight. He said, I want to fight in Japan. I want to fight in Japan. And you know what happens when you ask for it? You usually back it up. Ryan Bader, great fighter. God love him. But I have a feeling that Rampage is just going to destroy him.
David, I think we're going to have to agree on this one. I'm taking Rampage as well. Based on what you just said, he asked for this fight. When Rampage asks for a fight, he's going to be motivated and determined to go in there and get the job done, especially going back and making his return to Japan. He's just going to bring too much experience in there against Ryan Bader, and that's just that. Third fight, very exciting fight at 170. We have Akiyami Sexyama versus Jake Shields, who's been struggling as of late. Who do you like?
I love Sexyama because he just brings it. He comes forward, walks through punches. His fight against Chris Lieben was one of the greatest fights of last year, I thought. But I'm going to have to go with Jake Shields. I believe that he's going to come back from his 2 losses. The last loss, I don't really count. His father had just passed away, still had the courage to step into the octagon and bring it against Ellenberger. But I'm going to have to say that he bounces back with his wrestling and just dominates Akiyama.
I think, first off, let me just say I'm going with Akiyama because I think he's going to want to keep it standing, and he doesn't want to see Jake Shields on the ground because Jake Shields on the ground is nasty. Akiyama, like you said, is a tough opponent, and he's going to need to bring his A game. And being that it is in Japan, that's why I give him the edge, because I think he's going to be training that much harder and preparing well for Jake Shields. And let's be honest, he had a horrible showing against Vitor Belfort in his last fight, and I think this weight drop was very good for him, and Sexyama gets it done. Well, it does it for 5 rounds and pound for pound with Brian and David. As it is customary with all episodes, we will end with our pound for pound rankings. Since the welterweight interim title was just crowned last night, let's start with our welterweight rankings. David, what's your list?
Number 1, no changes here, no surprise. George St. Pierre's taking it home. Right behind him, though, you got to give it to the interim champ, Carlos Condit. It'll be an interesting matchup to see those 2 fighters go at it. Behind Condit, Nick Diaz. I think that he's proved a lot, and he's still right there in the mix. Then, I've got Johnny Hendricks after his beatdown on John Fitch. It was a great knockdown, so I got him moving up there. Behind Hendricks, I've got Jake Ellenberger, Josh Koscheck. After Josh Koscheck, BJ Penn, even though he is semi-retired, we'll say. Behind him, John Fitch, Jake Shields, and Rory McDonald rounding out my top 10.
That's interesting. I think most notably that you put Johnny Hendricks that high with that 1-punch knockout over John Fitch. For my list, I agree, George St. Pierre. I mean, he is undisputedly one of the best pound-for-pound fighters right now. Behind him, I do give my respect to Carlos Condit in his win. Nick Diaz is following Carlos Condit. And then I have Josh Koscheck. I still think Josh is a very high opponent, and I think he's going to be looking for some great opponents coming up, possibly Nick Diaz, as was said at the post-fight press conference. Behind Josh Koscheck, I have Jake Ellenberger, who's fighting Diego Sanchez next week. Jake Shields And then I have Johnny Hendricks. You know, I think that punch over John Fitch was amazing. It was incredible. It did a lot for his career, but I don't think it made him go that high up in the pound-for-pound rankings. As I'm going to need to see a little more from Johnny Hendricks in order to put him high up there. Behind Johnny Hendricks, I do have John Fitch. John Fitch has fallen quite a bit after that loss to Johnny Hendricks. Behind John Fitch, I have BJ Penn. You know, like you did say, he is semi-retired. I mean, he's still an admirable opponent for anybody. And let's not forget, I mean, this is a guy who is very undersized for this weight class. And what he has been able to accomplish is remarkable. And then rounding out my top 10 is Diego Sanchez. And that'll be a great fight coming up February 15th on FX between Diego Sanchez and Jake Ellenberger. And that'll be an amazing fight that could determine a #1 contender. Well, that does it for us here at Pound for Pound with Brian and David. Catch us next time as we review UFC 144 and other hot debate topics in the UFC. Please follow us on Twitter and Facebook and find all our episodes on Marquee's website, marqueemedia.com. The handle for Twitter is _pound_for_, and the Marquee Media is on Facebook, and find us for a complete list of shows and fun photos. David, anything you want to say?
Until next time, fight fans, keep your tips up.
See you cage side. We're out. Who you got in the Super Bowl?
Is that rhetorical? Are the Giants going to beat the Patriots?
Damn, we can't agree on shit.
I mean, Tom Brady.
Tom Brady and Pats are going to win it, 34-27.
You know, there's not going to be a rush. They ain't going to rush the ball. Giants are going to take it to them. Pass rush is going to.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. The Giants' front four is absolutely nasty, but. And I mean, there's a lot of momentum right now behind the Giants. And they do a lot of trash talking too.
They do.
But you know, they back it up, I guess.
Are we going to the Super Bowl party, or where are we going?
Yeah. No, I didn't get invited.
Angela's not going?
That's why we're recording today.
Angela's not going there?
No.
It's a shame.
Yep.
It's cute though.
I know Dana White's rooting for the New England Patriots.
He's rooting for, big Boston guy.
Boston guy, yeah.